It's a pleasure to be able to introduce our speakers today. My name is Christopher Brown. I'm a professor of geography and environmental studies. David Ortiz, the Center for Latin American and Border Studies faculty fellow, was called me unexpectedly, and he has asked me to introduce our speakers. As a little side note, please turn off your cell phones. You put on vibrate. Be much appreciated. I was on KRWG-TV. My darn phone. It was very embarrassing. It's a pleasure to introduce our speakers today. The presentation that we have is Standoff for Democracy, an analysis of Peru's ongoing political crisis. We have two speakers we're honored to have join us today. The first of these is Dr. Inigo Garcia Bryce. He is a professor of Latin American history at our own New Mexico State University. His publications include Reina de la Torre and the Pursuit of Power in Peru, Latin America, and Crafting the Republic, Lima's Artisans and Nation Building in Peru, 1821 to 1879. He is currently working on a biography of Peruvian ex-president Juan Garcia and some pretty cool stuff available in that later. Our second speaker is Lulinar Fernandez. He was born in Puno. He has a BA in Communication Sciences from La Universidad Nacional de Altiplano de Puno. He has been a journalist since 2004 for the newspaper La República, conducting investigative journalism on varied topics. His work has been recognized with various national and international journalism awards. He's embedded in Peru, reporting on the political crisis, and is coming to us through the magic of Zoom. With that, I will turn it over to my good friend, Dr. Garcia Bryce, and I will be in the back.
Thank you for being here, and also those of you who are on Zoom. Let me share PowerPoint here. And good to begin. Let's see, let me just get used to what's going on here. Where am I? I'm here. You're there. Some people are out there, but we can't see them. They're there. So the title of the presentation is Standoff for Democracy, an analysis of Peru's ongoing political crisis. One question is, will democracy survive in Peru? The other question, if your question is there democracy in Latin America, then you should take my class. There is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give some fairly general information that helps us to contextualize what's been going on in Peru, primarily protests that have been going on since December. And then my colleague, Lubomir Fernandez, we have the honor to have him to report from what's going on the ground. He's a reporter for the Peruvian newspaper La República, and he has been basically covering the events in Puno, which is where he's from. So we'll be able to have these two perspectives, and then we'll open it up for questions. Now, the election in 2021 in Peru was historic. Historic because it was the bicentennial, and therefore, whoever won the presidency was going to be leading Peru into its third century of independent life. The two candidates who were in the runoff election, there was more than one election because there are so many candidates in Peruvian presidential elections that you have to get 50%, and usually nobody gets 50%. I think there were about 25 candidates in the first election. And then, so these were the top vote getters. One is Pedro Castillo, you see here on the left, with his pencil. He was a rural school teacher. His background was very unusual, and this made it particularly historic. The idea that somebody who was from a rural peasant background for the first time would become the president of Peru. This never happened before in the past. And so he emphasized his role as a teacher, hence the giant pencil. He even made it somehow or other onto one of the late night comedy shows here in the US, where the joke was that he was looking for his giant notebook. But what he's doing really is emphasizing education and his own role as using the hat, which became sort of one of his signature pieces of attire to emphasize his rural background. And then on the other hand, we have Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who was dictator of Peru from 1990 to 2000. And this was her third run as president. He was representing the left of the political spectrum, she very much the right of the political spectrum in Peru. The election ended up being very, very narrowly won in favor of Castillo by only about 40,000 votes. And immediately Peru showed that it was not impervious to the worst influences from abroad. In this case, the Trumpian tactic of trying to say that the election had not been legitimate, and that is what they did. And once Castillo came into power, there were a number of efforts on the part of the right to basically impeach him. There were marches. This has echoes of the Cold War here, calling it the communist dictatorship of Castillo. Castillo was part of a party called Peru Libre, and this is there's a lot of complexity here, so I'm going to try to sort of keep it as simple as possible so that we can move on with the events. But he was running as sort of a substitute candidate for a party called Peru Libre, which was a Marxist party, is a Marxist party, because the person who headed that party had been indicted and could not run. And this opens up a whole other issue in Peruvian politics, which is the issue of corruption and the underlying issue of corruption, which is also why this was a very hopeful election, because the last, I've lost count, 6 presidents of Peru. There are 3 of them in jail right now for various different charges, including corruption and also abuse of human rights. So there was some sort of hope that this would be a fresh start in Peru. But immediately, his political enemies tried to get rid of him. This sign says vacancia ya. This vacancia is the vacancy, basically referring to impeachment. And here there's a little detail, which is that there's a mechanism within a legal mechanism within Peru that makes it very easy, both for the president to dissolve Congress and for Congress to get rid of the president. Maybe we would like to incorporate that last part here at some point. But this mechanism was abused, and already 2 presidents just in the last few years, so because Peru has had 6, so you get a sense of the political crisis we're talking about, Peru has had 6 presidents over the past 6 years. And 2 of those were removed with this mechanism whereby Congress is able to remove the president, declaring him morally incapacitated. And this goes back to some strange 19th century law that allows them to do this. So they sort of revived this law, and it's created a great deal of instability in the Peruvian political system. I think that also in terms of the underlying attitudes toward Castillo, as somebody from the Andes, as somebody from indigenous descent, I think you have to understand the huge divide that exists between Lima and the Andes. Historically, this goes back to colonial times. It goes back to even to the most basic factor, which is geography. The fact that in Mexico, as you know, the Spaniards founded their capital where the Aztecs had their capital. And so there was sort of a convergence there. Whereas in the case of Peru, they didn't. The Spanish founded their own capital, Lima, which became a European city, as opposed to Cusco, which was the Inca capital. And back in colonial times, it was even difficult for indigenous. There was a special neighborhood for indigenous people in the city. It was difficult even for indigenous people to get into the city. So you have that divide that goes back to colonial times and that has persisted. And of course, those cultural attitudes towards indigenous people have persisted in Peru. And I think I have a slide which I was looking for at the last minute, trying to convert, because this is a picture I took. I think I have it all the way at the end. Yeah, actually, no, here it is. It's right after here. actually even put it in the right place, where you have this sort of paper mache statue of Castillo as a rat, right? And so I think that actually also says a lot about the sort of attitudes of people in Lima towards somebody who was coming from the countryside. Now, and somewhere on there, it says something about communism as well and about terror. One of the other things that his political enemies tried to do was to equate him and his followers with terrorists, and that resonates very strongly in Peru, because during the 1980s there was an insurgency by the Shining Path, which was declared to be the most violent terrorist group in the Western Hemisphere. At the time, 70,000 people were killed in the process of this civil war. And so being accused of being a terrorist has a lot of weight, and is also, of course, a way of discrediting the legitimacy of the president, which is what they were trying to do. And so this continued. Unfortunately, Castillo didn't help himself, because one thing to understand is that he had very little political experience. He had experience as a union leader, but he did not run a good government. He didn't have a very clear policy. He named one person after another to his cabinets who were accused of corruption, who were then removed. He was never really able to even get a very stable cabinet. And finally, so anyway, the point being that he didn't help himself. He didn't turn out to be a very good president during the time he was there. You can combine this with the fact that he was being attacked and he was constantly on the defensive. But he certainly didn't have very much political experience. And perhaps what really shows this is the way he ended his rule, because in December of, just in December of last year, faced with another possible attempt to impeach him in Congress, he tried to anticipate this by staging a coup. And he staged, he basically said he was going to close down Congress and so forth. There was one problem, is that he didn't have the support of the military. And so you really do need the support of the military in you're going to stage a coup. And so what ended up happening is that he ended up very isolated, having to flee, and fled to try to seek political asylum in the Mexican embassy. This part sounds like it might be out of a Garcia Marquez novel, but he got caught in traffic and arrested by the police, and he's now in jail. So he's one of the 3 presidents that's in jail, 2 of them awaiting trial, together with Fujimori and Alejandro Toledo, who was only recently sent back to Peru. He was extradited to Peru just a few days ago, actually on corruption charges. So this sort of sense of hope disappears with this disappointment of him, because he also was he was embroiled in some corruption scandals, and that is going to be one of the accusations against him, in addition, of course, to violating the Constitution by staging a coup. However, I think we see a contrast here between Lima and the provinces, and especially the southern Andean area, which is where he got most of his vote. I think I have a map here. There's Castillo. Let me just jump to the map, because this is the electoral map. Actually, this is from the first round, so that's why you have more than one color. But all of the red was Castillo, and so I think it's a little bit like the red-blue situation that we have here, where there's increasingly sort of a cultural divide between the cities and the countryside, and you have this with deep historic roots in Peru. And so many of the people who had voted for him, even though they weren't necessarily too pleased with Castillo, basically felt that there was a great deal of symbolic value in the fact that he had gone to Lima, they had sent their representative to Lima, and now he had ended up in jail. And protests erupted throughout the country, basically with the call que se vayan todos, that everybody should go, not just, he was succeeded by his vice president, who was Dina Boluarte. Let me put a picture of her up here. And also historic, because she became the first female president of Peru. But there was an overwhelming sense that this government lacked legitimacy. there were two things that there were two things that Boluarte did that began to undermine her legitimacy. The first was that in order to rule, she forged alliances with what would be Castillo's and her own political enemies on the right, and as well as the military. So she decided to take a very hard line. And this hard line was also, in fact, people in the street were calling her traidora, right? That she was a traitor because she had been the VP for Castillo under his same ideology, a socialist ideology, but then had sort of turned ideologically just sort of to be able to stay in power. And the worst manifestation of this was the way that she handled the mass protests that erupted throughout the country, and about which my colleague Lubomir Fernandez is going to talk in more detail. Basically, she declared a state of emergency, which allowed her to send out the military. And between the military and the police, over 60 people were shot as a result of these protests, thus further undermining her legitimacy. In fact, just today, the headline of the newspaper where Lubomir writes, oh, I guess, yeah, that's not it. Well, I tried to copy the headline, but this is what came out. Basically, what it says is that, I don't know, it did something to the fonts, and I wasn't able to actually capture the whole the whole newspaper headline. But we don't have to talk about my technical limitations right now. We can do that some other time. The main point is that Human Rights Watch had done an investigation and declared that 39 of the deaths during these protests had been by people who had been directly shot, in this case by the military and police, and 34 of those cases were people who had been shot above the waist. And so she is now being prosecuted, and she is probably fearful, given the history of prosecution of Peruvian presidents. I mean, I guess that's the other side of this coin, because it doesn't look good when you have so many presidents in jail. On the other hand, Peru has managed to prosecute a number of presidents for corruption and human rights. So perhaps there's something to be said for that. And it has set a precedent where he is probably fearful of leaving power, which is one of the demands of the people because of what might happen to her once she loses the immunity that she possesses as president. These are some of the pictures of the protests. Most of these, I believe, are from Puno, where Lubomir Fernandez is from. These protests went on from December and January. They were very unusual because you had people from the provinces, tens of thousands of people from the provinces who actually came to Lima to protest. There was the perception at some point that this was going to destabilize the government and that she would eventually have to resign. It's an interesting contrast that one of these former Peruvian presidents that I mentioned, a man named Merino, and who only lasted in power for 5 days, in a very, very different context, had to resign due to protests in Lima where 2 people had been killed. And I think that the difference between 2 people killed in Lima and 60 people killed in the province is interesting in terms of the way that these lives are valued in the Peruvian context. I just want to say something sort of a little bit personal in terms of my own experience on the impact of these protests, because the protests lasted through December. Then, in a very sort of courteous and civilized fashion, the protesters said that they were going to have a truce so that everybody could go home for Christmas and New Year's, and then they were going to start again in January. And I was visiting Peru at the time with my family, and we were able to travel just sort of during that truce period to this place, which you probably recognize. If I can get my slides in the right order, which is Machu Picchu, which is the main tourist destination in Latin America. And of course, this was a time of year when it would have been absolutely full of tourists. There was absolutely almost nobody there. It was sad to see these rows and rows of stores of people who basically make their living from tourism, who were affected by this because the train had closed down. One of the tactics of the protesters had been to close down roads. In some cases, airports were also closed down. And so people obviously didn't want to visit Peru. In fact, one of my colleagues here in the history department had her tickets all set for Peru, and she had to cancel them, even though I tried to encourage her and say it'd be fun to be in the middle of some protests. But that's not what people are looking for when they're going on for tourism. But I guess the overall point is that whom does this hurt? Unfortunately, it actually ended up hurting many people who live off tourism and who don't have the resources to be able to survive through these long periods of protest when the economy is very, very severely affected. Now, I think I'm going to go ahead and move on so that we can let Lubomir give his presentation. He is going to talk in Spanish and I'm going to translate. So that might also take a little bit longer. But in terms, I just want to come back to these. There are, I think, sort of three different things. One is these cultural attitudes that have persisted in Peru. I still hear comments about how the Aymara people, who are the indigenous people of the very southern Lake Titicaca area, are actually barbarians. I mean, people will still use this word barbarian. Incredible, I think, in this day and age. But the notion that many Peruvians in Lima don't see the rest of the country as citizens. The other is just the weakness of the political system. In other words, how can democracy survive without political parties? Peru's political parties have been devastated over time, and that has opened up the way for people to just run. And Castillo is a little bit of a symptom of that, where you can just sort of get a newcomer who comes into office. Often people running just to enrich themselves, and unfortunately, there's a long tradition of this in Peruvian and Latin American history that actually goes back all the way to the colonial period, and that, believe it or not, has a certain strange logic, because back in the colonial period, the Spanish monarchy did not have the resources to pay for a bureaucracy. This was the first modern bureaucracy, in the first sort of European modern bureaucracy that extended to Latin America, but they didn't have money to pay for it, so people would become judges or enter other offices with the idea of personal gain. Tax collectors, for example, would skim some off whatever it was they were collecting. So this sort of blurring of the private and the public, unfortunately, has deep roots in Latin America, but it's become worse with the absence of political parties accountability, and it's created this huge corruption problem, which is also a problem of political representation. Because not only do you not have parties to represent people, but the people that do represent you, you don't trust anymore because they're in there basically to steal. And so I guess I hate the term the perfect storm, but there's a little bit of that element here with all of these various things coming together. And I think that I'd like to just end with a quote from Octavio Paz. Very often the nature of the debates in Peru about how to develop the country and how to move ahead have to do with the economy. Octavio Paz has a quote in which he says that the problems of economic development are not economic problems, they're political problems. And right now, Peru has a crisis in its political system, a crisis of representation. And if that crisis is not resolved, then these problems are going to continue, and it's not clear. And I'm certainly not going to venture as a historian to try to predict the future. So let me open up the floor for my colleague Lubomir Fernandez, and let me see how we can best do this so that I translate for him. And I believe he also has a power presentation. So thank you. Lubomir, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, perfecto, ahora sí.
Entonces, ya te presentaron y te agradecemos que estés con nosotros y procedemos. Yo voy a ir traduciendo lo que, así que si lo podemos hacer de a poquito para ir traduciendo.
Perfecto, vamos. Voy a compartir la pantalla. Ahora se ve la pantalla compartida.
Creo que no te escuchamos.
Ahí me escuchan, perfecto. ¿Sí? ¿Me escuchan? Perfecto.
Ahora sí.
Perfecto. Se ve la presentación, ¿verdad?
Espérate, vamos a sacar la mía. Ya, ahorita te van a dejar. Ahí está.
Bien. Se ve perfecto ahora la pantalla, ¿no?
Sí.
Perfecto. Bien. Primero, muchas gracias a todos. Gracias por la invitación y gracias por la convocatoria. Les voy a pasar a exponer lo que con una protesta política en la capital del país termina, digamos, extendiéndose en las regiones del interior del país, al cual yo le he denominado crónica de una crisis anunciada, parafraseando un poco a crónica de una muerte anunciada de Gabriel García Márquez.
We're going to talk a little bit about how this political protest reached the part of the country that I'm from, and I've titled the presentation Crónica de una crisis anunciada, or Chronicle of a pre-announced crisis, going off the famous story of García Márquez, Crónica de una muerte anunciada, Chronicle of a death foretold.
El altiplano puneño es una región asentada a los 3.800 metros sobre el nivel del mar. Es una población definida y marcadamente por poblaciones quechuas y aymaras. Esta es una imagen que, digamos, que evidencia que todavía hay poblaciones en esta parte del país que conservan, digamos, sus formas de vida ancestral. Por ejemplo, esa es una imagen de la población del sur, pero es una muestra de cómo los pobladores todavía es una región donde tiene arraigadas a culturas, ¿no?, muy vinculadas a su geografía, a su historia, a su tradición. Además que también tiene poblaciones también muy urbanas en la capital de la región, que es la ciudad de Puno.
So the area of Puno is up in what's called the Altiplano, or the high plains that are located at 3,800 meters above sea level. The people speak Quechua and Aymara. These are populations, as you can see, that are very connected to their forms of ancestral life. These are cultures that are rooted and connected to their geography and to their history, although there are also growing cities in this area.
La región Puno es una región con altos niveles de pobreza, anemia, pero que también, así como hay cifras estadísticas que no benefician, es su riqueza cultural, su riqueza histórica, la que hace también que estas poblaciones sean de invalorable importancia cultural, sociológica, política, ¿no? Son poblaciones que han aprendido a dominar la naturaleza, cosechan, viven de la producción ganadera, agrícola, en las condiciones más difíciles. Pero que eso tampoco ha significado que sean poblaciones pues, que vivan del todo aisladas, ¿no? Simplemente la geografía, la distancia, para ellos les es más difícil salir adelante que cualquier persona que vive en la urbe, que también es también difícil salir adelante, pero que también cada realidad esconde su propia peculiaridad.
People who have a rich ancestral and cultural heritage, they're populations that have learned how to survive and how to dominate a very difficult environment of nature and agriculture. It's because these areas are so isolated, are so far removed. It doesn't mean that they're completely isolated. They are connected to the rest of the country, but it's much more difficult for them than for somebody in the cities to get ahead and to be able to make progress with their lives.
Estas poblaciones en las últimas elecciones presidenciales votaron por Pedro Castillo y el 89% de la población le dio su voto a Pedro Castillo. El primero, como una forma de protesta, porque estas poblaciones todavía viven sin beneficiarse de los recursos naturales, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay comunidades que ven salir de sus pueblos oro, cobre y otros, pero que siguen, se mantienen en pobreza, que no ha cambiado sus vidas. Y entonces, al elegir a Pedro Castillo, lo que han hecho es elegir a alguien que lo represente, canalice esa indignación, descontento, reclamo para que las cosas cambien. Y entonces Pedro Castillo obtuvo el 89% de la votación en esta parte del país, un porcentaje de votos que nunca antes ningún otro presidente obtuvo. Nunca han tenido tanto apoyo, y entonces era una región eh, que por su importancia irradia a las regiones vecinas como Arequipa, Cusco, Moquegua, Tacna, irradia cualquier descontento o reclamo. ¿Por qué? Porque también las poblaciones de este sector rural migran hacia estas ciudades, y en estas ciudades crecen, pero nunca se desvinculan de su pueblo.
So these populations voted overwhelmingly for Pedro Castillo, 89%. This was a form of protest because these are populations that remain very poor in their communities. In many ways, their lives have not changed. And so this was a vote for change. No president has ever gotten this high proportion of a vote in this particular region. And the importance of Puno also radiates to other regions around it in the Andes, to Arequipa, Cusco, and so forth, particularly because of migration, because people from Puno migrate to these other areas. And so the events that happen in Puno also have an impact throughout the whole southern region.
Luego de que Pedro Castillo ordenó la disolución del Congreso de la República el 7 de noviembre del 2022, las poblaciones vieron en esta imagen. Esta imagen es cuando yo hablo de una crónica de una crisis anunciada, es que ya desde que Pedro Castillo ganó las elecciones, los sectores políticos nunca reconocieron su victoria. Dijeron que había ganado con fraude cuando, digamos, la realidad no tenía respaldo en esa versión, una versión del fujimorismo, como otros lo conocen como la derecha peruana. Se anunció los resultados a boca de uno que le daban la victoria a Pedro Castillo y no lo reconocían como presidente, dijeron que había ganado como fraude. Y es a partir de ese momento que ya lo habían condenado a Pedro Castillo. Cuando Pedro Castillo anuncia la disolución del Congreso, porque el Congreso le ponía trabas, obstruía, a eso se sumaron los medios de comunicación, y entonces esta imagen del día 7, a Pedro Castillo reducido, digamos, rodeado, humillado, vejado, por un representante del Ministerio Público, la fiscal de la Nación, el jefe policial, los fiscales. Esta imagen ha calado tan hondo en las poblaciones del interior del país, pero particularmente en Puno, porque es la región que más ha resistido, que más ha luchado. Dentro de 4 meses lo vuelven de familia, 4 meses. Y entonces el concepto que la gente ha desarrollado es que en el país lo que hay es una lucha de intereses, y que en el país la justicia no es para todos, porque si bien se ha anunciado el cierre del Congreso, que mientras se hacía su anuncio, muchos aplaudían en redes sociales, esta no terminó materializándose. Pero lo que la ciudadanía le llamó es decir, ¿por qué en el caso de Pedro Castillo la justicia es tan eficiente que lo detiene tan rápido, pero para otros casos de corrupción que vinculan a expresidentes se le sigue un debido proceso, y la ciudadanía ha entendido que a su presidente, al que han elegido, al que es igual que ellos, porque es un proceso rural, lo que es, han entendido que en el Perú no hay justicia, y lo que hay más bien es la justicia se desenvuelve dependiendo de la clase social a la que pertenece.
So after the dissolution of Congress by Castillo, this is where I call this a chronicle of a foretold crisis, because ever from the even from the time when he was elected, Castillo was not accepted by the main political sectors in Peru. In other words, his victory was not recognized. There was the attempt to say that it had been a fraudulent election on the part of the Fujimorismo, the followers of Fujimori, or what's also just referred to as la derecha, or the right in Peru. This particular photograph of him being arrested and booked after the dissolution of Congress shows him here being humiliated. The Attorney General, the police are there, and this image had a very, very deep impact in Puno, where it was seen as an example of the fact that justice doesn't work the same for everyone. That the question is, why was justice so efficient in coming after Castillo immediately when there are other presidents of Peru where there have been long drawn out processes? And this led to the further conclusion that there's really no justice in Peru for everybody. There's not equal justice, but that rather justice depends on your social class.
La noticia de que Pedro Castillo fue detenido hirió tanto al sentimiento de las poblaciones rurales que entendieron que en el Perú la justicia se maneja políticamente, se maneja a la tendencia mediática del momento, y luego vino una sucesión constitucional. El Congreso vaca a Pedro Castillo y elige a Dina Boluarte, que era la vicepresidenta. Si bien la ciudadanía reconoce que hubo una sucesión constitucional, pero lo que hubo no hubo una sucesión política. Pedro Castillo fue elegido para representar y tenía una política de reivindicación a las poblaciones rurales, pero sin embargo la sucesora Dina Boluarte lo que hizo es estar más, en vez de continuar la perspectiva política de Pedro Castillo, que era más reivindicativa, por el contrario, se alió con el Congreso de la República y además adoptó un tipo de política muy común en los partidos de derecha, es decir, usar la represión, el estigma de terrorista, de senderista, de comunista, de socialista, para a partir de ese cliché, digamos, aplicar un tipo de represión brutal. Y una vez que Pedro Castillo fue encarcelado, las poblaciones aymaras y quechuas del altiplano se movilizaron, y una de las principales acciones que se adoptó fue enviar delegaciones de puneños de todo el sur del país hacia la capital. Ahí vemos una imagen en donde se ven despidiendo a sus representantes que fueron a la capital, a Lima, a protestar para exigir la renuncia de Dina Boluarte, nuevas elecciones y que se vayan todos, ¿no? Y fueron cada comunidad, localidad, enviaba a sus representantes, sus delegaciones, mientras aquí en el altiplano puneño las huelgas indefinidas continuaban. Así despedían los comuneros a sus paisanos para que los representen en Lima. Eran poblaciones quechuas, aymaras, que no estaban contentos con lo que había pasado en el país, y lo que querían era que renuncie a Dina Boluarte. Renunciando su dimisión, hacía de que el presidente del Congreso asuma, y el presidente del Congreso lo que provocaba era que se convoque elecciones en 6 meses y todos se iban. Y entonces las protestas continuaron con mayor contundencia en varias partes y varias regiones del país.
The picture of Castillo being put in jail also was very difficult to take for people in Puno. It confirmed the notion that justice is used politically. Dina Boluarte, who was his vice president, was elected. This was a legitimate constitutional succession, but people did not see it as a legitimate political succession, because she did not continue with his policies that were in favor of the people. Rather, he turned to repression. And once he was jailed, people began to mobilize, and the pictures that you were seeing here are people of delegations of Puno that are saying goodbye to their delegations that are going all the way to the capital in Lima. That's not it's not a short journey. It's like 20 or more hours by bus. And the call was que se vayan todos, that everybody should leave, that there should be new elections, that the Congress should also be shut down, and they were asking for the resignation of Boluarte, and hence the protests continued.
Las protestas congregaron a todos los sectores políticos, a todos, o sea, todos los gremios se salieron a las calles, en un hecho nunca antes visto las regiones del interior del país salieron en protesta por una causa política, la causa política de nuevas elecciones y que se vayan todos, y no querían más a los congresistas, pero la política del gobierno de Dina Boluarte era militarizar Puno, o sea, es decir, se aplicó un plan de represión militar policial que no veían a una población que estaba reclamando políticamente, sino por el contrario, veían a Pedro Castillos multiplicados por miles, es decir, lo que veían en la calle eran enemigos políticos, ¿no es cierto? Y no veían una ciudadanía movilizada que también tiene el derecho de expresarse, que también tenía el derecho de mostrar su rechazo, y entonces la represión en la ciudad de Juliaca terminó con 18 muertos el 9 de enero del 2023, y 2 comuneros aymaras en la zona sur, y otros, no, un comunero en la zona aymara en la zona del sur, y 2 ronderos quechuas en la zona de Carabaya. En total son 21 muertos que se registraron en el altiplano por represión directa de la policía. Las fuerzas de seguridad del Estado pensaban que con ese nivel de represión la ciudadanía iba a frenarse por el miedo, por lo duro que no se mostraba el gobierno, pero al contrario, eso ha generado también que las protestas continúen, y ya no, las poblaciones salieron en distintas manifestaciones a protestar. Esta es una imagen que prueba cómo las poblaciones aymaras incluso salían a rezar de rodillas para que se vaya el gobierno. Apelaron no solamente a la protesta en la calle, sino también a las plegarias para pedirle que Dina Boluarte se vaya y que haya nuevas elecciones. Aún mientras eso sucedía en las ciudades, en las comunidades, los pueblos estaban en pie de protesta, estaban protestando. Las comunidades originarias, esta es una imagen de un pueblo Uros que vive en el lago Titicaca. Es un pueblo, son habitantes de estas islas que les hemos mostrado al inicio, que son poblaciones que casi nunca están en las protestas, ¿no? Esta imagen de ahí, de habitantes de estas islas también han salido, en un hecho que nunca en la historia de Puno una protesta política ha congregado a todos los sectores, transportistas, biciclistas, y entonces el objetivo era uno, nuevas elecciones, que se vayan todos, y no querían que la derecha gobierne, ¿no? Acá vemos, por ejemplo, esta es la imagen de la Virgen de la Candelaria, digamos, una imagen religiosa muy importante aquí en la región de Puno, pero que debido a las circunstancias también un sector de la iglesia ha protestado por las muertes y vistieron a la Virgen de la Candelaria de negro en protesta por las muertes, y en las comunidades por turno se organizaban para protestar, y la aplicación de horarios de protesta respondía a que las poblaciones no dejen de hacer su vida habitual, pero que también estén presentes en todo momento durante las 24 horas del día, y que sin duda en días determinados venían a la capital de la región a marchar por miles. Es un hecho nunca antes visto en toda la historia de la República del Perú en 200 años.
These protests brought together a number of political sectors and economic sectors, economic organizations, such as, for example, the Union of Transport, transport union. This hadn't been seen before, a protest of this magnitude in this region. The response on the part of Boluarte was to militarize the situation. The government did not see, when they saw these protests, they did not see citizens legitimately protesting. What they saw was Castillo multiplied by 1,000. They saw them simply as political enemies. And as a result of this, on the 9th of January, there were 18 people killed in the city of Juliaca, as well as 3 people killed in the countryside, for a total of 21 deaths on that day. There was direct repression on the part of the police. The government thought that this would stop the protests. However, the protests continued. There was an image. ¿Puedes poner la imagen en que están rezando de rodillas? There's an image of them praying for the government to go away. In the various different communities, they continued to protest. The Uros, for example. ¿Puedes poner la foto de los Uros? And they're from those islands that you saw earlier in the that are on Lake Titicaca, there's never been such a conglomeration of various different sectors, all protesting. They dressed up the Virgen de la Candelaria, the Virgin of the Candelaria, which was very, very important in Puno, and this was also a way in which the sectors of the church were also protesting against the violence. And the communities, because these people are organized, they're very well organized in communities, were taking turns to protest, and here you see them blocking the road, so that there would always be 24 hours a day, there would be people protesting, and thousands of people marched.
Las comunidades aymaras son pueblos que tienen la característica que sus determinaciones son colectivas, es decir, nada de lo que ellos no hagan no tiene determinación que no sea en una asamblea. Y las comunidades, cuando llamaban a sus tenientes gobernadores a asambleas públicas para debatir, ellos se movilizaban, caminaban kilómetros con tal de hacerse presentes en la protesta, hombres, mujeres, niños. ¿Y cómo es que ha durado tantos meses de protesta contra un gobierno que rechazan? Y es que han aplicado la estrategia del comunitarismo, es decir, colaborar entre todos, a todos afecta la huelga, todos pierden su trabajo, todos se afectan de algún modo, ven afectados sus negocios, pero las comunidades han entendido que la única forma de resistir es uniéndose e integrándose. Esta escena prueba en evidencia que, por ejemplo, comparten todos lo que mejor producen, y lo que vemos ahí es papa, chuño, tunta, que son productos deshidratados en el río, en la helada, pero que devienen de la papa, o sea, es la papa que la deshidratan en el río, en la helada, y se convierte en tunta, en chuño, y ese criterio de apoyarse en estos 4 meses de huelga, porque la mayoría no han trabajado, los negocios paralizados, entonces han resistido del modo en que están viendo, es decir, una organización comunitaria, y todos venían así, apoyando con banderas, diciendo de que el pueblo, el país profundo, no está de acuerdo que no haya justicia en el país, de que las muertes no queden impunes. Y en las comunidades, las mujeres eran las que tomaban determinaciones, porque detrás de las mujeres hay hijos, hay nietos, hay sobrinos, hay esposos, hay familia. Y entonces la protesta política en la que han muerto jóvenes, adultos, niños, ha hecho que la ciudadanía, de todos modos, desarrolle un tipo de conciencia, y esa conciencia los ha llevado a entender de que en el país la justicia no es igual para todos, y entonces es una población rural que vive de la ganadería, la agricultura y otro tipo de actividades comerciales locales, la que se ha levantado en pie de protesta. Hace poco han muerto 6 soldados, hijos de los propios comuneros, y las poblaciones también se han levantado en protesta y han desencadenado en más protestas, en más movilizaciones, y ha hecho que la situación se mantenga en pie de protesta. Y todavía continúan las acciones de protesta. Ha bajado la intensidad porque después de 4 meses hay muchos comercios que han quebrado, pero ellos han entendido que hay movilizaciones continuas que las van a retomar las protestas el próximo 28 de julio, y para entonces las poblaciones están abasteciéndose de recursos, de alimentos, de ingresos para poder, digamos, retomar lo que van a ser las nuevas protestas a partir del mes de julio. ¿Por qué julio? Porque julio es un mes en donde se renueva políticamente el gobierno, en donde un gobierno tiene que responder al país, y entonces sería el 28 de julio, del mes patrio, en el que Dina Boluarte va a tener que responder al país, y las poblaciones del Perú y del interior del Perú no están dispuestas a permitir que le rindan cuentas, si no es en medio de protestas y reclamos que todavía insisten en su renuncia. La esperanza es que se vayan y se convoque a nuevas elecciones. Hay en estos momentos, hay una organización que se mantiene, pero que todavía hay reuniones permanentes, constantes debates, que está haciendo que, por ejemplo, organismos internacionales vean con preocupación lo que está pasando en las poblaciones, más allá de lo que se puede ver en la capital del Perú.
The way in which these communities, these communities protests has to do with the fact that they take they make their decisions collectively. They're made in meetings, assemblies that are held where these issues are debated. Here you see people walking often many kilometers to be able to attend these meetings. And this is what has allowed the protest to go on for so long, is this communal aspect. Everybody's affected by it. People know that everybody's going to be losing work. Here, la foto de Chuño, here we see them sharing food. Those are dried potatoes called chuño, which are a way of preserving the potato high up in the Andes. The criteria is to support one another, and that these deaths not remain unpunished. Often it's the women who are very much behind these decisions, who are making decisions for their families. And the result of this is that there's been much more consciousness raising amongst the population about the general situation of justice and injustice in Peru. Remember, it's primarily a rural population. Some months ago, 6 soldiers lost their lives in some of these incidents, and they were actually children of some of the members of the community, and so they were mourned by the communities. The protests have continued, however, they have decreased in intensity. A lot of businesses have gone bankrupt, but people are beginning to plan again for new protests. They're beginning to collect food and prepare themselves for new protests that would take place on the 28th of July, which is Peruvian Independence Day. And it's also when the president gives a sort of State of the Union address. And the idea is for Boluarte, who will give that address, to be accountable and to be held accountable. The demands continues to be for new elections to be held, and that she not be able to give her State of the Union address without there being massive protests outside. The international organizations have also begun to take note of these events and of what's been going on in the country.
Quisiera cerrar mi participación con esta imagen, indicando de que lo que hay en las regiones del interior del país es un pueblo que no está dispuesto más a permitir que un gobierno quiera gobernar con gente que no ganó las elecciones, pero gente que además no valore el sentido sano de la política, que es trabajar por quienes más lo necesitan, sin la necesidad de pensar en ninguna idea de comunismo, ni socialismo del siglo XXI, porque lo que han demostrado las poblaciones quechua y maras es que ellos saben trabajar. Lo que no quieren es ver invertido un mes de su sueldo en un precio de pasaje aéreo. No quieren no quieren trabajar un día para un balón de gas. No quieren invertir, digamos, todo un día de su esfuerzo para invertir, digamos, en el costo de los dos menús. Entonces hay una crisis económica, una crisis social, que lo que esperan, que lo que exigen las poblaciones es que los gobiernos creen mejores condiciones para los ciudadanos y que no todos estén sujetos al mercado, en donde la gente se provee del servicio y el bien de acuerdo a su posibilidad económica, cuando lo que demandan es que las cosas mejoren a partir de que haya mayor accesibilidad de servicios y se reivindique a las poblaciones que han sido convocadas a elecciones, pero que después de elecciones han sido dejados de lado.
I'd like to close with this image that shows that a people that is not willing to allow its government to not take them into account. They have a healthy sense of what politics is about. This is not communism or the socialism of the 21st century. These people know how to work, but they have very low wages. They want to be able to not have to spend a month of their wages just to buy a plane ticket or a day of their wages just to buy gas for their kitchen. They're looking for a better life, and that not all should be not dominated by the laws of the market, but rather that there should be better services for the populations of this region. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
You should field the questions, Chris, as the moderator.
Muchas gracias.
Are there any questions?
So you need to watch chat or Q&A feature.
Oh, you can do the questions, okay. We don't
Or like
really
I'll relay them.
Okay, so we have some time left for questions. I find it to be fascinating. So we'll turn to the room and then we'll see what comes in from the web. Professor Stanford?
¿Qué ha sido el impacto de estas manifestaciones en el discurso político en Lima? Como por ejemplo, hay políticos, hay periodistas, hay gente que sí apoyan este movimiento indígena, que ven que sí tiene razón, o es solamente el gobierno contra la gente en la campo.
Does that translate?
The question is for him, ¿no?
Sí.
Sí. ¿Escuchaste la pregunta?
De fondo, no lo escuché bien, pero te escucho a ti.
La pregunta es, ¿cuál es la posición? ¿Qué impacto ha tenido esto en la gente en Lima? Si es que hay gente en Lima que apoya a la gente en Puno, o si solamente es el gobierno contra ellos, o si es que tienen aliados, si hay gente en Lima. Voy a traducir la pregunta. The question is whether it's just an opposition between the people of Puno and the government, or whether there are people in Lima that have been affected by this and are also supportive of their cause.
A ver, lo que pasa es de que hay varios aspectos para entender esa pregunta. Primero, que el gobierno ha aplicado un criterio de estigmatizar a los manifestantes, poniéndoles el rótulo de comunistas, de senderistas, de terroristas, y con ese criterio desde los medios de comunicación han sido, digamos, estigmatizados, ¿no? Y entonces, con esa versión, hay sectores que también en la capital los han visto con cierto prejuicio o con cierto miramiento, ¿no? Y también, si bien es cierto que en la capital ha habido apoyo de poblaciones migrantes, lo concreto es que cuando partieron de las regiones del interior del país hacia la capital, nunca ha habido una respuesta porque los medios han encargado de opacar, ¿no es cierto? Y todo lo que se veía solamente en redes sociales, ¿no? Por lo tanto, ha habido apoyo, sí, pero por ejemplo, el gobierno ha intervenido la Universidad San Marcos como si fueran a estudiantes, los ha puesto como terroristas, y a los manifestantes como si fueran grupos armados, ¿no? Cuando en la práctica eran poblaciones que han ido muy pacíficamente a protestar, son poblaciones que se han movilizado desde el interior de las regiones hacia la capital, y ese estigma ha logrado que digamos, el apoyo se divida, ¿no? Aún así, ha habido apoyo y para ello los medios de comunicación, no todos, pero la mayoría, han jugado un rol muy importante en dividir y partir, pero la respuesta también del interior del país es que ha habido cada vez mucho más unidad, se han integrado mucho más y eso ha permitido que haya en estos momentos mayor cohesión social.
Part of the problem is that the government has stigmatized the protesters, labeling them as communists or terrorists. And often the media has gone along with that particular portrayal, leading to greater prejudice against people who are protesting. There really hasn't been as much of a response from Lima, and the media has really not given a clear sense of the conflict. There has certainly been some support, but then there's also been repression in Lima. For example, there was support at the University of San Marcos among students, but the government also sent was also repressive against those protests that were actually peaceful protests. But this situation has also led there to be greater solidarity and greater unity in regions of the countryside.
Do we have any questions online, David?
Yeah, so we have one for somebody submitted anonymously. How has the political turmoil affected the Peruvian economy and recent economic development gains?
Can you just read it again?
Yes.
Please.
How has the political turmoil affected the Peruvian economy and recent economic development gains?
And it doesn't say for whom. Question.
No.
Podemos, bueno, yo puedo contestar. La pregunta es cómo ha afectado esto a la economía, ¿no? La economía peruana en general. Si quieres responde y después yo respondo también.
A ver, indudablemente las protestas después de 4 meses han afectado a todos los sectores, pero también han entendido las poblaciones rurales, indígenas, que ellos no se han sentido tan afectados porque ellos literalmente viven de la tierra, es decir, cosechan productos de primera necesidad y lo acumulan, lo guardan, viven en el negocio local, tienen carne porque crían ganado, tienen productos andinos, tienen la papa deshidratada, convertida en chuño. Entonces, a las poblaciones rurales no los ha afectado tanto, pero que sí a los negocios de las principales ciudades, del sector turismo, del sector minero, que ha visto detenía sus exportaciones porque no se podían movilizar las exportaciones, las importaciones. Y entonces, esto, lo malo diríamos que haber frenado los índices de comercio, ¿no? Pero lo bueno es que ellos han entendido es que tampoco vale tener un gobierno absolutamente, o un sistema que dependa absolutamente del mercado, porque de lo contrario son poblaciones que han entendido que si no mejoran las cosas, por ejemplo, no van a cambiar las cosas para bien y para todos.
Certainly, Many sectors have been affected. Curiously, some of the most rural sectors have not been as affected because they depend on the land, and therefore they're not as connected to the market. The mining sector has also been affected and has stopped somewhat. So there are different impacts in different areas of Peru. And what I would add, yo voy a añadir que en realidad por el lado macroeconómico creo que siguen un poco las cifras igual, ¿no? Y es hasta cierto punto una medida de que la economía peruana bastante, o sea, marcha bastante en función a una economía de exportación, de grandes exportaciones que hasta donde tengo entendido no ha sido afectado, no han sido afectados los números como uno hubiese pensado. But what I'm saying is that I think in some ways it's also a measure of the structure of the Peruvian economy, because given all of these protests, the macroeconomic numbers have remained somewhat unchanged, and that has to do with the fact that you have a very export-oriented economy where you're exporting minerals, where you're exporting agricultural products. Peru just became the top exporter of grapes in the world, and if you look at your asparagus or artichoke hearts, some of the things you buy here at the store, you'll see that they're from Peru. So agro-industry has been a big part of that. There was a question. Do you want me to read the next question? It's in Spanish.
Yeah, go ahead. But yeah,
I saw it here.
The fourth one, so that's why we were just going in order.
Oh, go ahead then. Go ahead.
So the next question is there anyone, perhaps a figure, who can bring the different political forces together and return Peru to a path of growth and stability? If not, how do the panelists see the country moving forward?
La pregunta es si es que pensamos, la podemos responder los dos, ¿no? Pero te voy a dejar a ti que respondas primero. Si es que pensamos que hay alguien que pueda congregar a todas las fuerzas políticas y llevar el Perú hacia un camino de crecimiento y estabilidad. Y si no existe esa persona, entonces, ¿cómo vemos nosotros que vaya a poder salir adelante el país?
El gobierno ha intentado dialogar, pero de manera poco fructífera, ¿no? Primero porque ha estigmatizado a las comunidades como si fueran comunidades terroristas. Eso les ha ofendido. Y segundo, que ha tratado de vincularlos a algo morales, ¿no? Y eso también era falso. Y además, las poblaciones del altiplano casi no se dejan manejar por nada extranjero. Son poblaciones que históricamente incluso nunca permitió que los incas los conquisten, ¿no? Ha habido acuerdos, pero los incas nunca han podido conquistarlos, a los aymaras sobre todo. Y los quechuas han sabido convivir. Y entonces el gobierno ha querido imponer la ley con las armas y no lo han logrado. Y el acuerdo, la posición es que si es que no se va a Dina Boluarte, no va a volver la paz. Ellos están dispuestos a dialogar con cualquier gobierno que resulte electo, pero no quieren a Dina Boluarte y lo que quieren es justicia. Ellos sostienen que mientras no haya justicia, no va a haber paz en el país, y lo que vaya a haber en adelante es una lucha por la comunidad. Es decir, no pueden permitir que un gobierno que se preciaba de ser democrático, que se preciaba de respetar a la mayoría, puede haber matado a sus connacionales, ¿no? Y por eso es de que ahora las protestas están llamadas como la protesta por la dignidad, es decir, de que por ningún motivo no piensan olvidar sus muertos, no piensan dejar de lado a sus paisanos que han luchado, ni tampoco piensan dejar de lado los agravios que han recibido el gobierno hoy, en estos momentos. El acuerdo es no permitir que ingresen las Fuerzas Armadas, la Policía Nacional, los prefectos, que son los representantes políticos del gobierno, y en su lugar las comunidades están poniendo a sus ronderos, a sus representantes, para que, digamos, controlen los actos de violencia, controlen problemas sociales, y es una muestra de que no están dispuestos a aceptarle al gobierno todo lo que ha pasado, y menos que los haya estigmatizado y no hayan visto a ciudadanos.
So the government has attempted to dialogue a little bit, but mainly its posture has been to stigmatize those populations. They've also tried to connect them to Evo Morales, who was the president of Bolivia, socialist president of Bolivia. But these are populations that don't let themselves be dominated by people from outside. They weren't even dominated by the Incas back in the day. And what they want is justice. There's the sense of horror of a government that has killed its own citizens, and they will not forget their dead. And one of the things that they've done is that now they're not allowing the armed forces, the soldiers, the military or policemen into their communities, and they're beginning to delegate those positions or those jobs of maintaining safety to their own people within the community. Yo solamente voy a agregar, ahorita te lo traduzco, pero so I just wanted to say that as far as I can see, there isn't somebody that could play that role, that unifying role. Interestingly enough, I'm writing a book right now about Alan Garcia, who was an excellent politician, and I've heard some people say, but Alan Garcia committed suicide three years ago. So I've heard people say, oh, you know, he should, if he were here, then he would be somebody who could congregate these different political forces. And there's even a myth that he's still alive, but that's a whole other story. I'm not going to get into it. Solamente estaba diciéndoles que desde donde, o sea, desde mi punto de vista, yo no veo que haya un político que surja, que pueda congregar a las distintas fuerzas políticas, y que por ahí uno que otro, porque yo estoy escribiendo un libro sobre Alan García, y que uno que otro por ahí dice que de repente hubiese sido Alan García el que hubiese tenido esa habilidad política.
I have to be the timekeeper.
Oh, okay.
You've given me the terrible job. So what I'd like to do is allow our visitor last word,
Okay.
if that's okay with
Parece que ya tenemos que terminar. Entonces, te damos a ti la palabra final.
Bueno, yo quiero agradecerles por la convocatoria, felicitarlos por este tipo de eventos, por preocuparse en lo que pasa en el Perú. Y yo simplemente quiero destacar en esta oportunidad el valor de los pueblos originarios, el valor de la solidaridad que mucho se ha visto ahora, el valor de que los pueblos, yo veo que están viviendo un despertar que no lo habían vivido antes. Mencionabas a Alan García, y Alan García ha cedido a las protestas del 2011 en el embarazo, que protestaron contra las protecciones primeras, y Alan García cedió. Y lo que pasa es que, digamos, lo que no se entiende todavía en el Perú es que no se debería fijar una mirada política de la capital hacia el interior, sino del interior hacia la capital. Porque si bien es cierto, hay muchas cosas buenas y positivas en el sentido macroeconómico, lo cierto es que también en el sentido social muchas cosas todavía no cambian en el país. Yo creo que por el bien de sus ciudadanos, por el bien de quienes están en investigación, podamos ver cambios. Muchísimas gracias por la convocatoria.
I just want to thank you, and I also just want to highlight the value of indigenous people in Peru, the value of solidarity, the value of this awakening that has taken place. With respect to Alan Garcia in 2011, when there was a protest among the Aymara, he actually was he ceded to their demands. But what's not understood, and is very important, is that Peru has to be a country not where the capital looks on the provinces, but rather where people can understand what the view is from the provinces of the capital. Many things have not changed in Peru, and they do need to change. And I'd like to thank you very much.
We can join and thank our. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Muchas gracias.
We have a class.
Muchas gracias. Gracias por la convocatoria. Abrazos.
Ya, un abrazo, ya estamos en comunicación.
Vale, gracias.
1:30.